Hello, my name is XPLovecat, and today I'm going to be reviewing a one-shot scenario called the Harlotville Horror and providing some keeper tips for those who would like to run this scenario. It was published by Andy Miller on the Miskatonic Repository, and it takes about 4 to 5 hours to play. This scenario was inspired by Robert E. Howard's short story called Pigeons from Hell. So it's definitely my recommendation to read this short story before you would dive in to play the scenario. I think it helps with the atmosphere and getting you kind of in the mood. And there's also a special enemy type that's added in this scenario that's never been in a Call of Cthulhu scenario before, which is pretty cool. And you'll learn a lot about them in this short story. The general premise is that your players are from the Midwest Refining Company, and they've been hired to go check out an abandoned town because there might be oil there. And of course, since it's abandoned, nothing bad's gonna happen. Right? This scenario takes place in 1929. Your players soon learn that this town was abandoned during the Mexican-American War, but they're not exactly sure with the specifics of what went down. Now, the cool thing about this scenario is that they have some history all in the beginning parts to kind of get you a feel for what actually happened during the Mexican-American War and a little bit about oil in New Mexico where it takes place. So one of the really cool parts of this is learning about those parts of history and bringing them into your game. And if you're interested in learning more about how you can add history to your games, I made a video all about it. Now, from this point forward, I'm going to be including some major spoilers. So keepers, listen up. I'm going to have some great tips for you if you're interested in running this scenario. Included are 6 pre-made characters, which my players ended up really liking. They had specific personality quirks and things written on their sheet that they could grab onto to roleplay. Like one of the players that had bad allergies, so whenever someone smoked, it really irritated them. And then another player was superstitious, so that was something that they could grab onto and play with. So that was really cool. The only thing that I would recommend is making sure that one of your players chooses Roger Stanford. He's pretty much like the leader of the group, and I didn't make anyone choose a specific pre-made character, so no one ended up choosing him. But then it felt a little bit weird when we didn't have the leader as a part of the group. So just a small thing, I would recommend that you have at least one player play Roger. In addition to your players, there will also be 6 workers that go along with this team. And these workers are essential, so do not skip on sending extra workers with your players. Now would be a good time to tell you about the enemy in this scenario. It's called the Zombie, and basically it's a kind of weird take on a zombie, and they're created with this black brew that converts them into this weird creature. And these zombies, they are very stealthy, and they're able to hypnotize and control animals and do some really cool things. But one of the things they do is they're slowly taking their victims and hypnotizing them. So it's really essential that you're starting to ramp up the scenario and do these with the NPCs or these workers and not your main players. That way they can really feel the tension and see these workers slowly disappearing and getting murdered. And so that is really what made this scenario great. And a keeper tip for making sure that you're managing these 6 workers, I just basically told them that I'm going to assume the workers are doing whatever the main players are doing as well. So they're kind of always around, working, doing the same things, unless otherwise declared. So it puts the onus on your players to decide what they're doing, and so it's not you controlling everything that they're doing as well. The other cool thing to mention is all of the equipment that's needed for this trip is listed out in the scenario. So you don't have to worry about your players spending time going to the store, declaring what they're gonna take. It's all written out so you can get right into playing the scenario, which I thought was fantastic. Let's talk about getting to the ghost town. So one of the cool things is that they included some drive auto checks to be able to determine when they're going to arrive into town and if they run into any trouble along the way. So there's some guidance for what you're going to be interacting with to actually get to this town. There is a map of the town included, which is also essential. Make sure to give this to your players because there are a lot of different buildings to keep track of. And I was able to give them this map when they first arrived and told them to mark on the map where they were setting up camp so that I was aware of what buildings were close by and where zombie layers might be. My players actually got there pretty late and they decided to start work in the morning. So that means I had all evening to start the action. And this is where the scenario really shines. Andy gives a lot of great descriptions and the tools to build the atmosphere and make it something that is really building tension and setting the scene. For example, like bats flying overhead and various different descriptions that you can use to kind of give your players a little fair warning and up the creep factor. The first evening rolled around and there are two main things to consider during the sleep phase. One is dreams and the two is murders. So the dream section is something that you can affect your players with. You basically have them roll a power roll, and if they fail, they have these weird dreams. The dreams are from the perspective of the zombie, so you're actually watching the players arrive into town through this dream, and you can give little hints as to where these zombies' lairs are. So I had one player that failed, and I was able to give them a little bit of hint by them seeing a pool table in their dream to show that that was one of the places that these zombies were having their lair. And so you're able to kind of give them hints and pieces through these dreams. Now, of course, you can't predict if your players are going to pass or fail, so just be prepared to adjust the amount of information you're giving based on how many players have different dreams. If there's a bunch of players, then maybe they can put the puzzle pieces together, but if there's only one, you might give them a little bit more information to try to get them on the right path. Now, the second thing to consider are the murders. So the first night I had one of the workers get hypnotized by the zombie and promptly murdered. Once someone is murdered, they turn into a short-lived zombie. So basically, they come back to life, and their main goal is to hunt down the other players and try and kill them. But they don't last very long. In the description, it's basically until the flesh gets cold, and that's pretty much GM discretion of how long, but probably no longer than a few minutes. How I worked this was that they lived until there was a first successful hit on the zombie, and then they immediately died. I felt like that kind of added to the atmosphere and the weirdness that was going on. And so that's what I used for this criteria. After this worker is hypnotized, you will have your players do a hard listen check. If any of them pass, they wake up and see this dead person walking towards them. So they're probably a little weirded out, don't really know what to do, might take different approaches, but pretty soon the zombie's gonna die and they're gonna have a lot of questions. At this point, my biggest tip for you is to make sure that the other workers start kind of gossiping about this worker that just passed away. And so they might be saying things like, oh, well, he was having a rough time. Oh, he was a little weird anyway. He was kind of crazy. To get in the ear of your players to say, this was just a fluke. Nothing weird is going on here, but this specific worker had some problems, and so we should just move past it and we'll do our work and go home. That way, they're not immediately wanting to run away, but you're slowly ramping up the horror. If all goes according to plan, they wake up the next day and get to work, trying to pretty much finish up the job as fast as they can so they can get out of there. This is where the strange occurrences list is really helpful in the scenario. There's basically a bunch of different bullet points that you can pull from to try and up the creep factor and really make it an environment that is immersive for your players. Now, if you're like my players, you went to work outside, but you sent some of the workers in the buildings to try and check stuff out. Either way, the buildings are going to give some clues as to the horror that happened that actually made the town get abandoned, which was these zombies attacking all of the townspeople and running them out. There's a ton of different buildings, but only a few that actually have concrete clues, mostly the brothel, and this is where you can have a lot of fun. Inside, there's some cool things, including a music box, but this is where the scenario, I think, missed out on a little bit, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. The music box was something really cool and intriguing, and he even listed some music that you could play with it, but it didn't actually do anything. So I have a suggestion for where we can play with that a little bit more at the end of the scenario. Your players will probably continue to work throughout the day or do some investigation. But one of the workers gets quite spooked towards the end of the day and he starts to flee. Now you can either do another murder or you can have him run away. In this case, this person just went on foot and went missing. So that was another piece of information that was a little bit weird and not sure what happened to this worker. So now they're having more questions about what's going on. The next night, I had another worker get murdered, and this was pretty epic. So there was one building that had a bell tower. He actually was hypnotized to climb up the bell tower and fall off. And for this visual, basically the people that were awake saw him fall and then get right back up and start walking towards them, which is very creepy and made for a really great atmosphere and immersion into this game. Now, at this point, they're probably going to want to run. They do have 2 cars, but remember the Zoombies can control animals. So one of the cars is filled with snakes, and the other one is broken gas line cut either by the Zombie or rats or whatever animal might have disturbed the car. So they're not able to take the cars out to flee. So at this point, do they stay or do they go on foot? And this is where I get into one of the downsides of the scenario, which is that my players felt like they didn't have a ton of great options. They could stay, discover what is causing all this madness, and fight it, or they could run away on foot but go in the desert where they might get lost. So those 2 options didn't feel very good to them, which I admit is quite Lovecraftian. But it's something that made them feel like they were more experiencing a story rather than actually playing a game. So I do have recommendations for if you want an additional option for your players. You could either give them a spell that is able to disperse the curse or change the zombies back into humans, something that is more active to solve this crisis. Or you could play with the music box some more because that was really intriguing to me and I wish there was something else you could do with it. So maybe you would have some kind of opposite hypnotize, like the zombies are able to hypnotize you, but the music box turns that off or hypnotizes them and makes them come to you. So something that is able to make the players have a little bit more control in the outcome. The way the scenario ended for my group was that the zombies slowly started to attack them. They decided to stay in town, and eventually all the zombies were awoken and were attacking and climbing up the brothel and climbing into windows and murdering them, and no one survived. Which I admit was quite a lot of fun for me to play, but like I said, the players felt like they didn't have a ton of control. So another suggestion would also be to have not all the zombies awake at a time. So they're supposed to be slowly coming to life and coming in, out of their hibernation. And there's a total of 13. So I had 13 at the end of the game going at my players. But maybe you only send 3 or 4 at a time. Once your players take care of them, then they have some more time to investigate and figure out where the layers are and defeat them in chunks instead of bringing the whole horde to them. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this. I would just have your ideas in your back pocket and see how the scenario is unfolding for your players. The other major keeper tip is if you do eventually kill one of your players, make sure you take them into another room, explain that they're going to turn into the short-lived zombies so that they can still be active in the game and are hunting down the players until, of course, they get hit. At which point you would turn over any of the workers that are still alive to their control. So overall, this scenario was great. We had a ton of fun with the atmosphere and the immersion of the game, and I loved the new enemy type included in this scenario. I thought like it did a really good job of the descriptions and being able to provide me with the tools to tell a really great story and provide a horror-like environment. The horror was great in it. So my players only had that complaint about not having a ton of control towards the end of the scenario. So as long as you add some additional options for them, I think this scenario is going to be a ton of fun for you and your players. That was my review for Harlotville Horror. Hopefully that was helpful for you and that you enjoy learning about some new Call of Cthulhu scenarios. If you do, please make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future scenario reviews that I do. And make sure to check out these videos that might be of interest to you. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.